Morning, everyone, and welcome to the first seminar of the Genaut series. Our theme for this year is the followers of the apostles in cultic context, and today we have Jakob Engberg with us. It is my pleasure to welcome Jakob. Um, He's an associate professor in church history at the Department of Theology and the chair of the PhD program for theology, history of ideas, and philosophy at Aarhus University in Denmark. He did his PhD in history at the University of Southern Denmark and has been a guest professor at the universities of Kiel and Greenland before taking up his current position. He has published and lectured on subjects such as the conversion and Christianization of the Roman world and on the martyrdom of Polycarp. In this seminar, he'll address a particular dimension of the latter, the care of the remains of Polycarp in the martyrdom of Polycarp within its second century context. Jakob, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And Dan, are you able to share my PowerPoint presentation? Perfect. We just stay on the title slide for now. Chapters 17 and 18 of the Martyrdom of Polycarp, traditionally dated to the mid-2nd century, describe what happened to Polycarp's bodily remains after his execution. These chapters matter for scholarship on saints because they are often cited as the earliest evidence for an emerging martyr cult interested in relics and an annual commemoration. On one common reading, the gathering of bones, their elevated valuation, and the anticipation of a yearly celebration suggest that a martyr cult already existed in mature form by the mid-2nd century. But since the late 19th century, other scholars have disputed this traditional dating, often precisely because of these chapters. The practices sound to them more at home in the 3rd or 4th century, so they infer a later composition date or later additions. My proposal is different. I think both dominant readings are teleological. They take later Christian practices as the lens and then read backwards and find chapters 17 to 18 to be evidence of either surprisingly early martyr cult or anachronism. Against both, I will argue that the concerns expressed over Polycarp's remains neither presuppose a developed relic cult nor require a later date. They fit a 2nd century context when read against Greco-Roman burial and commemoration, Roman penal treatment of executed bodies, and 2nd century Christian martyr theology. So these chapters confirm rather than challenge a 2nd century dating, and they are better read not as the cult of saints in full bloom, but as 2nd century piety and reflection that later developments could build on. So switch to slide 2, please. In mid-February 155 AD, at this time of year, a local persecution broke out in Smyrna in Roman Asia Minor. Christians were brought into the stadium. Most refused to recant. They were executed by exposure to animals. One man, the Phrygian Quintus, recanted under pressure. The crowd then demanded Polycarp. Polycarp, the elderly bishop, had withdrawn to first one, then another house in the countryside to avoid persecution, and the narrative presents him as praying and then foreseeing his death by fire. He was eventually located, arrested, and brought into the stadium. There he was pressed to curse Christ, revel the Christians, and swear by the emperor's genius. He refused all of this. The proconsul had the herald announced 3 times, Polycarp has confessed to be a Christian. The crowd then assisted in gathering wood, and Polycarp was burned. It is at this point, in the immediate aftermath of the execution, that my focus begins. What happens to his body, and what the text concerns about his remains do and do not imply. Please switch to slide 3. The martyrdom of Polycarp presents itself as a letter from the church in Smyrna to the church in Philomelion. The Christians in Philomelion requested an account, and the Smyrnians responded with a narrative of Polycarp's death. Please switch to next slide. Philomelion lies in Phrygia. This is a modern map, but in Roman times, and there's a recent article on this in Vigilia Christianae, it sat within well-established road networks west towards Smyrna, but also toward all the other urban centers with Christian communities to the north, south, and east. The letter encourages the recipients to forward copies further. So it presents itself not as private correspondence, but as a circular letter intended for broad circulation across an already connected network. Please switch back to slide number 3. Structurally, the letter recounts the earlier martyrdoms, Polycarp's arrest and interrogation, and his execution. Then, crucially, chapters 17 to 18 describe what happens to his remains. The letter concludes with reflection and encouragement. Chapter 21 supplies a dating formula, as namely Statuus Quadratus as proconsul and Philip of Tralles as high priest. This situates the events in roughly 155 AD. Chapter 22 presents itself as a later copyist edition. For today, I focus on these chapters 17 to 18 highlighted. Please shift to slide 5. Okay, here are 4 common reasons some scholars contest the mid-2nd century dating and why each is weaker than it first appears. So the challenges are in black and the responses are in blue. First, on the genre. The text is sometimes called the earliest martyr narrative, and therefore the origin of a genre. From that angle, it can look too mature. But it presents itself and is a letter, and epistolary writing is already a basic Christian form, and accounts of suffering and martyrdom also appear prior to our text, embedded in other genres, Gospels and Acts being obvious examples. So genre does not force lateness. Second, Quintus the Phrygian. Some read his role as anti-Montanist polemic. Montanism, of course, originating in Phrygia, and therefore later. But there is a simpler explanation. The letter is addressed to Christians in Phrygia, as we have seen, and stressing that Quintus is Phrygian and has arrived recently from Phrygia is relevant information for the audience without implying any polemic. Third, Catholic. Some take the term as a marker of later Orthodox over against heresy language. But the term, when employed in the martyrdom of Polycarp, also, or rather simpler, function as a designation that Smyrna is part of this worldwide Christian universal church. Precisely in the act of communication across regions to this universal church. It reads naturally, therefore, as universal ecclesiastical language. It continues with earlier patterns rather than being read as an anti-heretical boundary-making term. Fourth, the legality of seeking out Christians in light of Trajan's rescript to Pliny. Some argue that the search for Polycarp would be illegal and therefore anachronistic. But that depends on treating Trajan's letter as universally normative rather than situational. And it was situational. And most basically, it makes the flaw of treating a prohibition as proof that the prohibited practice never occurred. Historically, prohibitions are most often issued precisely because a practice is occurring and needs curbing. So simply it's methodologically the wrong way to read a normative source. Finally, and most importantly for our papers, chapters 17 and 18 are often taken to reflect martyr cult and relic veneration that seem too developed for the mid-2nd century. That is the question I now address. Please, next slide. I should perhaps say that the previous slide, it was an image of a French delegation visiting Smyrna, and this is the location of the stadium as it appeared around the turn of the previous century. And now switch again, and here we have the remains of a chapel or church dedicated to Polycarp that was completely destroyed in 1922, but is also visible on this early postcard. Okay, two broad readings dominate in the different interpretations of these two chapters. One says relic veneration and annual cult cannot plausibly exist this early, so these chapters must be late or later additions. The other interpretation says that the text is mid-2nd century, so these chapters are astonishingly early evidence that the cult of martyrs is already emerging with relics and anniversaries. I suggest that both readings share a teleological frame. They interpret the text through what martyr veneration becomes in later centuries. Instead, I propose the concerns over Polycarp's remains fit naturally into a 2nd century context. They reflect burial expectations, penal practice around executed bodies, and theological reflections already available in mid-2nd century Christianity. Those patterns may contribute to later developments, but they do not presuppose them. Slide 7, please. The remains of Polycarp. Chapter 17 reports that the authorities acted so that not even his little body might be taken up by us, though many desired to do so and to have a share in his holy flesh. Koinonian is a flexible word. To share, participate, have in common, enter partnership. It can apply to meals, property, risk, association, even cultic contexts. The word itself does not automatically imply sacramental theology or relic practices. What is distinctive is, however, the pairing with hagios, holy, and with sarx, flesh. That combination signals a Christian context. Pagan Greek more naturally would use hieros for sacred, and while funerary life includes communion among the living at the tomb, it is normally imagined as communion with perhaps the spirit of the dead, not with the flesh. So the language is intensified and very concrete bodily. It expresses a relation to the martyr as holy and as bodily, simply. But crucially, the text still does not attribute miracles to the remains, nor describe ritual use of relics. And we would note here that this is not because the text shy away from highlighting miracles. There are plenty of miracles elsewhere in the text. Slide 8, and on slide 7 it was again an early postcard of the area, but seen from the other angle. Chapter 18 describes the handling of Polycarp's bones. The remains are highly valuable, more precious than costly stones. They are more valuable than gold, and the language is thus very elevated. But again, note what is absent: no miracle working power, no healings, no interventions. They report that they laid them away where it was fitting. The emphasis is on proper deposition. The site of deposition is not presented as the community's ordinary gathering place, but as somewhere they will come on specific occasions, like a tomb. There they will gather as we are able, and if the Lord will grant it, to celebrate the martyr's birthday. The phrasing is prospective and conditional. It suggests a practice anticipated, not yet fully established. The purpose of the gathering is also stated: remembrance of those who have contended, and training and preparation of those who may face suffering. So what we see is commemoration, encouragement, and moral formation, not yet the later ritualized cult of relics. Slide 9. Now I will show that the burial and commemoration features in chapters 17 and 18 are culturally normal, even if the language is Christianity intensified, so to speak. Proper burial was a strong expectation in the Greco-Roman world. Responsibility lay with family or with an association that provided burial for its members for a fee. annual fee. Denial of burial was widely experienced as an outrage. Antigone is the classic expression of that moral intuition. At the same time, Roman penal practice could target the body after death. Denial of burial, exposure, or destruction of the corpse served exemplary purposes. It prolonged dishonor and extended punishment beyond death, even into memory. Against this background, the Christian desire to secure Polycarp's remains is not strange. It matches common expectations of burial, and because the corpse could be used as a site of humiliation, retrieving and burying the remains can also be read as resistance to penal disgrace. Commemoration also mattered. Families and associations gathered at tombs on particular days, birthdays, anniversaries, feastal occasions, the date of the death of the deceased also, so the tomb could be a place of ongoing social connection sustained through remembrance. Finally, exceptional death could be honored in exceptionally dead historic characters could be honored in special ways, and remains could become focal points of communal identity. See, for example, the transfer of Theseus' remains to Athens as described by Plutarch. That kind of honoring the distinguished dead is culturally intelligible across the Greco-Roman world. So in broad cultural terms, burial, remembrance, and periodic gatherings are extremely normal. What is distinctive in our text is the Christian theological framing. So let's switch to the next slide. Worship of Polycarp, Polemic and Answers. Chapter 17 includes a key polemical exchange. Nicetas, a local nobleman, persuades the proconsul not to hand over Polycarp's body. His reasoning, lest having outdone the crucified one, they begin to venerate this man. The verb sebastai, revere, venerate, has cultic coloring. The author answers immediately. We worship Christ, and here we have proskunnemen, which is stronger cultic language, prostrate, even more clearly cultic. But the answer of the author is that this is what we do with Christ, but with the martyrs we only love them. The distinction is deliberate. Worship belongs to Christ alone. Martyrs are loved and honored. And he then prays that we too may become sharers and fellow disciples with them. The participation he desires is ethical and imitative, discipleship and steadfastness. Chapter 18 adds that the centurion ensured the body was burned thoroughly. The authorities act to prevent what they suspect, and in doing so, they intensify post-mortem humiliation. On the image, you have the relief depicting the story about the woman with an issue of blood, and you see her prostrate at Jesus's feet. This raises the question, is such an exchange, fear of veneration of martyrs, is that anachronistic? Does it presuppose a developed martyr cult? To test that, we can ask whether outsiders already perceived Christians in the 2nd century as showing extraordinary honor to prominent sufferers. One illuminating witness is Lucian. Next slide, please. In De Morte Peregrini by the 2nd century satirical author Lucian, mocks the cynic Peregrinus, who at one stage associated himself with the Christian and was imprisoned as a Christian. Lucian describes Christians flocking to him even from afar, visiting him, feeding him, and honoring him in prison, trying to ransom him also. He said, Lucian comments that they revered him as a god, au.theon, placing him second only to that man who was crucified in Palestine, whom they worship. Lucian is satirical, but satire relies on recognizable behavior. His mockery presupposes that Christians were known for honoring imprisoned leaders in ways outsiders found excessive. From the outside perspective, the line between worshipping Christ and honoring a Christian figure looks blurred. That is very close to Nicetas' fear in chapter 17. So the polemic in Polycarp is not necessarily a later projection, it corresponds to perceptions already present in the 2nd century. Next slide, please. And there are indeed other contemporary texts that concerned with what happens to a martyr's body. Ignatius of Antioch around 110 writes to Rome that he wants the beast to leave nothing of his body behind, so that not even his body will be seen. The fate of the body is here thematicized already. Later in the 2nd century, in the letter of the Martyrs of Lyon, a text totally mirroring as a genre text the Martyrdom of Polycarp, we read of bodies exposed by the Roman authorities, burned to ashes, and the ash swept into the Rhone, so that not even a remains. Here the destruction of the body is explicitly a tool of humiliation and extended punishment, as we talked about. So in near contemporary sources, persecution reaches beyond execution and targets the corpse. The Gospels also matter as background. The author of Polycarp shapes Polycarp's ordeal in imitation of Christ's passion, but there is a striking contrast. Whereas Jesus' body is explicitly by Pilate permitted burial, Polycarp is threatened with destruction and erasure. So the Polycarp account participates in an existing early discourse about martyrdom, punishment, and bodies well within known funerary and penal patterns of the 2nd century and earlier. I quickly skip the next 2 slides, which discusses a kind of Eucharist resonance in these chapters. And then I turn to slide number 15 with my conclusion. Let me return to the alternatives we began with. Chapters 17 and 18 have often been read in one or two ways. Either as astonishingly early evidence of a fully developed martyr cult, or as a later interpolation projecting later practices backward. I have suggested that both readings are shaped by a teleological horizon. Both measure the chapters against what martyr veneration later became. Read within its own setting, chapters 17 to 18 looks different. It describes the retrieval and burial of burned remains in ways consistent with Greco-Roman funerary expectations. It reflects Roman penal practices in which the corpse could become a target of post-mortem humiliation. It carefully distinguishes worship of Christ from love shown to martyrs. Its key language fits within 2nd century Christian theological traditions, and even pagan observers like Lucian suggest that Christians were already perceived as honoring prominent sufferers in striking ways. Nothing here requests a later date, nor does the text depict a fully formed cult of saints appearing overnight in 155 AD. Rather, the martyrdom of Polycarp gives us something historically more precise, a mid-2nd century witness to how one community honored its dead, resisted humiliation, and articulated that honor theologically. Patterns that could later contribute to martyr veneration and the use of relics without yet presupposing the later forms. A non-teleological reading lets the text remains what it presents itself as, an early account of a martyr's death, and a community's care for his body, rooted in its own second century world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jakob. That was a fantastic paper. I'm sure we have loads of questions in the chat. I'll wait a minute to see if those hands that I see are clapping hands or a raised hand for a question. I think there's already a question. Please go ahead, Bremer. That's the name I see on your screen.
Jan, you may need to, yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Jakob. Really a very clear paper, I would say, and really convincing. I have a few details. I think to start with the life of Peregrinus, as I've recently argued, this was written about 180. And with knowledge of the martyrdom of Polycarp. So we have Peregrinus not as a independent witness, I think, but anyway, I think we should be careful there. No, as regards the date of the letter, I fully agree with you. Actually, I have an article in the pipeline about the martyrdom of Polycarp as well. I fully agree with you with the attempts to post dated much later, like done by Candida Moss about a good decade ago, unconvincing. On the other hand, in the letter says, we only remember not Polycarp from the 11 martyrs. I find it very unlikely that the community would have written this immediately after the execution. Moreover, of course, Philomelium is, as the crow flies, 400 kilometers away. It must have taken quite a while, I think, before the community in Philomelium heard about it. Then they had to write back to Smyrna. The fact that they actually had contact between Philomelium and Smyrna is interesting too, because if you look in later translations, then you see that they no longer know the city of Philomelium, and they replace it by Philadelphia or something. But we actually do have an inscription in the inscriptions of Smyrna as edited by Georg Petzel, which shows contact between Smyrna and Philomelium during the time of Antoninus Pius. So it's perfectly possible. It's no guarantee, of course, but we're talking about plausibility and possibility. And finally, I don't think one should date the letters of Ignatius to 110. I have myself argued for say the middle of the second century. Very recent article by Marcus Euler also has brought additional arguments. It would you can see how 110 wouldn't really fit in with the other testimonia, whereas if we date it till say 150, 160 perhaps even, then the letters of Ignatius fit much better the other testimonia. Otherwise, it would be the odd one out, just as it was, of course, with monarchic and so on. In many ways, the date of 110 is very unlikely, it seems to me. So those are a few observations.
Should I respond? Thank you, Jan. And I still owe you a dinner
Yeah, I know from Berlin.
But okay, so I'm very interested in your article on Lucian having known Polycarp. That's simply amazing if that's the case, and I would love to read that article. I'm sorry I have missed that. I really like the idea that there was concrete exchanges between Christians and non-Christians. They were not shouting in different directions. They were really engaging with each other and talking with each other, even often polemically. So in that sense, it wouldn't surprise me. So that's interesting, and that would certainly do something about my argument about this being known and so on. But I think that even if that's the case, I know, I'm privileged to know that you know the article that I wrote about how outsiders viewed Christian martyrs, and that there's really quite strong evidence, not only in Lucian, but generally, that they were aware that something special was going on with Christians here. So I think I would be able to find other evidence if need be for that. Then this with the connection to Philomelion, that is really very important, and I want to thank you for that comment, that you have also noticed this and found an inscription on it. And again, I was not aware of this article until very recently, but in the latest issue of Vigilia Christiani, there is a really good article on this.
By Borges, I've used it too. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Then on the dating of Ignatius, I think we better not discuss that here. I really support the traditional dating of those letters also, but that's a whole different discussion. For my paper here, it would not make a huge difference if it was 140 or 150. It would still show that these thoughts are around at this time and so on. Did that answer?
Yeah. I think Ignatius is a thorny question and a bit outside the topic of your lecture. So
yes,
let's leave him lying there.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you for the response, Jakob. We have a question from Alistair now.
Oh, got it on. Hi, blessed day. Yeah, I don't want to get sidetracked into Ignatius either. Some of you may be aware that I pushed for a date precisely in the middle of the 130s for Ignatius on the basis of the movements of Hadrian across the empire. And I see Ignatius in his train. But Jakob, could you put your last slide up to help me kind of formulate the question? Because it's kind of big, you know.
Yeah, Dan can help me with that, I think.
Yes, please. I mean, fundamentally, as we wait, I mean, you said what I would have said on the whole, in terms of not seeing the issue, not seeing the discussion of the interment of Polycarp as in any way kind of pointing towards the later dating. But I wonder whether we have a bit of also part of the problem of the argument is a bit of a false dichotomy between, on the one hand, treating the martyr, as you call, like a heroic dead, and then the later martyr cult. So to say that they do not represent a martyr cult, yet it doesn't represent a martyr cult in a 4th or 5th century martyr cult way. But that doesn't mean to say that we can't have something like a martyr cult going on even in the 2nd century. And in particular, I want to pick up on this kind of, this important passage where they're now explaining the difference. And in particular, you see, because I argued in the past and intend to probably get back to it again one day, but what we have in the prayer of Polycarp, which I think is other part, the prayer of Polycarp is reflections of an early Eucharistic meal. and indeed reflections of an early Eucharistic meal. And I say Eucharistic meal rather than Eucharist because, the Eucharist is something that emerges as a normative thing, later on. But that various ritual meals of a supernatural nature, as it were, would feed into what finally became the Eucharist. And we have a Eucharistic meal, a martyrial meal, taking place at the gravesite in order to achieve some sense of koinonia. And I think koinonia is the word, to achieve a sense of koinonia with God or with Christ by achieving koinonia with the martyr. So you achieve koinonia with the martyr, and because you're then in the martyr's company, you're in the company of Christ because the martyr is in the company of Christ. In other words, what I think what we have here is an apologetic note, basically kind of suggesting to the state that what they are doing is not, as it were, is not a kind of relicita, but rather what they're doing is they're doing what is a familiar act, namely the observation of a hero cult. But I mean, the point in turn is that hero cults are means by which at ritual meals the hero comes to be present. So, in other words, I'm really asking, is there a false dichotomy here between Christian? I mean, I 100% agree with your major point that they mention like voluntary association, they're commemorating that they're achieving koinonia, and even that it's kind of a hero cult. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean to say it's not what you might call, in a 2nd century context, as opposed to a 4th century context, a martyr cult. There is cultic stuff going on here.
Yeah. Again, as with Jan Bremmer, I'm very grateful for your comment, and I think you're right that I should not present it as a dichotomy, and maybe I should be careful that it does not sound like a dichotomy. What the point I'm trying to make is that we should not sort of imagine, like, can I draw this parable that when Hephaestus struck Zeus in the head, Athene emerged in full panoply right away from his forehead. And it's not like that with the cult of martyrs, that we have 155 this text, and here, boom, we have everything all at once. So in that later sense, it's not cult of martyrs, and that then hinges on a kind of definition. How should we define relics? How should we define cult of martyrs? And I asked Maria and Dan about this before beginning the presentation, because I had thought about, this paper needs a section where I discuss definitions and so on. But then I thought, why should I, as an amateur, come up with this definition? Probably in the project they have already a working definition. But Dan and Maria, and that then maybe ties into your comment, they say that they would rather operate with nuances and with developments, and for that reason, yes, certainly I should not present it as a clear dichotomy, but rather say that we have very early stages, at least here, if that's how we could then frame it. But the main point, I heard you agreed with that also, is that it doesn't read anachronistically in the 2nd century.
Not at all.
Then you had some comments about the Eucharist language, and if I may take the opportunity and saying that I'm very happy about that also, because that was a section I skipped in my paper for time's sake, but I think you're absolutely right. There is invocation of Eucharistic language here, and in that section of the paper I then try to argue that this again is nothing new for Polycarp. We have it so to speak, already in Ignatius. Yes, I would also be open to 130 dating of this, but I do find it very difficult to move much beyond that. It is early second century, definitely in my view. But again, we shouldn't open that can of worms.
No, we don't want to go there. We really don't. I mean, it's, yeah. I mean, that's cool. Same as Sarksing. I've got a paper. I'm saying in press.
Yeah.
But it's in a collection, and we're still waiting on some participants, and they're 6 months late, and one of them gone and died. I'm editor as well. That's why, in which I suggest actually that Sarks is a Johannine Boo word, you see, and that's what's interesting is that suddenly in this text, Sarks becomes something positive, whereas and the point is that the reason about eating the flesh in John 6, even though Sarks is Johannine negative language, is that the Sarks is the medium by which is simply the inert medium by which the real thing is given, which is actually the blood, and the blood is the spirit.
That will be a good paper, yes. And what I find interesting, oh, sorry.
It's 2 years, but it's been 2 years since I wrote it, and I'm still waiting on other participants, and then we'll wait on publisher, so, wait another couple of years. But other thought is, and I just throw this in, it's I've never written on it, I've never published it, but thought it frequently. So, you might kind of chew on it, you might throw gain, use good Johannine language. The thought that what significantly changes in the martyr cult as the 4th century kind of runs on is that relics become mobile. I think that might be the kind of what makes the big difference, that rather than gathering at a gravesite to kind of have communion with the martyr will come to you.
Brilliant, yes.
So I'll just throw that in as a kind of stray thought.
Yeah. And that you can transfer relics to churches also and normal gathering places, and that was the point I tried to make. That here it's clear that they want to take it to a grave. It's not that they want to take it to a gathering place.
Yeah, but the grave becomes a gathering place. That's the point. Whereas
sorry,
the grave then becomes the gathering place.
Yeah.
Whereas and that fits in with hero cults.
Yes,
because they have the terminoi.
Yeah, and this about the Eucharistic language. It is interesting that the Soma and the Sarks language is exactly combined in the Martyrdom of Polycarp. So you have both strands coming together.
Polycarp is becoming increasingly interesting. And Danny, before you ask, I haven't started it. But I will. I've just got so many projects on at any given time, and such a heavy teaching load, and running a seminary as well. But I think my thing with Polycarp is that the key thing that happens, not necessarily Polycarp himself, but happens in the Smyrnian school, is that we have the meeting point of Johannine and Pauline Christianity. And so the language can become combined and mixed. But that's another stray thought, which I may eventually get round to doing something with, because I've got a commission that's already 3 years overdue. But, so there's another stray thought that you might just kind of want to run with. And I'm going to shut up now.
Thank you, Alistair. Thank you very much, Jakob and Alistair, for that conversation. We have Dan now with a question, I assume. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you very much. Illuminating paper. I think it's convincing. As far as I'm concerned, I mean, in that type of argument of imponderabilities, it states just as well as any other argument trying to place it later. My question would be about, I know this is not your main focus, but do we know anything about the cult of Polycarp beyond these situations, places of worship, what are, and how does the Martyrdom of Polycarp play out in that, if ever? Do you happen, did you happen to look even briefly in these sort of things?
Yeah, can you switch to the very last slide?
Just a second. Is it this one? No.
No, so beyond the ones that I showed you, beyond the conclusion. So this one.
Yep.
Because I described to Maria and the team what I wanted to do in the paper, and then we agreed on this, and then I don't remember when, maybe in early January, Maria wrote a kind email to me asking, could you please also do something about this? And I responded that I was not sure that I would be able to do this because I was moving offices and all my books were in boxes and so on. It's the university that we moved the building and so on. Long story. I only looked at it yesterday, and it was the briefest of look and 1.5 hours or something. So I don't have anything intelligent to say, but I did manage to find again these old postcards that I located somewhere some years ago on the internet from Smyrna, where this one is a bit closer up than what I showed you previously, supposed to show chapel, a church that is no longer there. It's gone. It was simply totally destroyed in 1922. And prior to 1922, there were 3 churches in Smyrna of relevance to Polycarp. There was the Smyrna's Orthodox Cathedral that was completely destroyed in 1922. Then there was a Catholic church that survived 1922. It's a church that was built in 1625, and it's down by the harbor, and that's why it escaped total destruction. And it has some very nice frescoes depicting the life of Polycarp. But 1625, you can hear that that's not a traditional site for veneration of Polycarp. That is a modern building, so to speak. So the best guess would be this completely destroyed church or chapel dedicated to Polycarp that we see on this image. And I have on this slide I have included links to this site where I found these old postcards, and there are also some other images of the site where this church used to stand, with the church still on it. Then I found an article from an American school of Athens or something, a popular article describing some early travel narratives. Spoon and Wheeler, they apparently traveled together to Smyrna and wrote each their own travel narrative, and they have both, according to this article, described the church as they were able to see it, but not in much detail, just a few words each of them. And I link that article also. That was all I managed. So yeah. Sorry.
No, this is very interesting altogether, even in a brief way. And thank you for addressing it as a late request, in addition to your paper as well. I would go back now to the paper and the not necessarily Christian context for. So you get on the one hand some parallels that are non-Christian, which is fine. Earlier and contemporary with the older dating of the Martyrdom of Polycarp. And I also agree that we don't need to imagine a two dichotomic type of cult of saints, I mean, there's no need to press any sort of too strict definition on that, because then you get that result of saying this is anachronistic because it's full blown with the forms we know later on. But some sort of continuum we can imagine, I believe, between the end of the martyrdom of Polycarp and the later forms. Does it sit well with how the martyrdoms are later and cult of saints and the burial practices, or post-burn practices as we have in the next century, what we have at the end of Polycarp? Is it full-blown what we see later, or is it just we can see it as something incipient or even peculiar compared to what happens later on with these sort of situations?
Yeah, I would say that it's very incipient. It's very rudimentary. The main concern is avoiding this affront of not being able to bury an important person. It's being very impious against someone to not even ensure him a burial, and they really want to avoid this. They want to avoid this humiliation, and also as a kind of resistance against this attempt at humiliating them. So they want a proper burial place, and of course, as all good people of that day and age, they want to gather at that place. So the emphasis is not on his small remains because they presume that they might have some miracle working power or can sanctify a location. It's more the other way around, that they want to honor his remains by being able to secure them. So very rudimentary, but I don't want to, I think it's perfect. I shouldn't draw a false dichotomy. It's definitely the building blocks. It's the roots, maybe in a sense, of later practices and
You're still
ideas.
figuring out what to do with them.
Yes. You're doing something traditional with them, but there is a new language.
Can I jump in here?
Absolutely, please.
Yeah, because I think you should also give some attention to the actual term martyr. As I have shown a few years ago, the first mention of martyr as a title is in the Apocalypse of Peter, which has to be dated, say, 140, 150, 130. We're not quite sure, but that's where it starts first. And then, so it means that the title of martyr as something special, and you can see that also in the letter of Vienne and Lyon, where some people say, no, we shouldn't be called martyr. So the title of martyr is still also in development. And that means, I think, that also the attention paid or the honor paid to people who died for Christ is in development at that time still. Martyr doesn't have the fixed meaning, someone who died for Christ, which it will have in later centuries. But I'm sorry, I have to leave. I have to prepare because we're already on our way to Vienna. So thank you very much for a very interesting paper and a nice discussion.
Safe travels.
Thank you.
Yeah, just can I just chip in as well? I think one of the issues on people like Canada, Moss, and Merrill is a failure of imagination.
Sorry.
I think one of the issues with people like Moss is a failure of imagination. But this is the point. They kind of see it in kind of clear lines and blocks. That here is a martyr cult. What happened in the second century? What couldn't be a martyr cult? Therefore, it can't be second century, because it's actually failing to sort of see the subtleties and the lines of development. And that's a fundamental failure in a lot of scholarship.
Yes.
And indeed, I think that probably comes over into the Ignatian debate as well. But again, we're not going to talk about Ignatius. Again, I think it's the same thing. It's a failure to, a fundamental failure of imagination. And
we'll get into Ignatius in a couple of months.
Yeah, a geological view of Christian development. But I say it's a wider issue than just this.
And I'm very interested in Ignatius because the two things belong together. Because
inevitably, and the two letters of Polycarp, or one letter of Polycarp.
Exactly. Yes.
Thank you. I think this is a nice place. I think we've come to a nice conclusion because we do have a talk on Ignatius later this year. So I hope to see you and maybe take forward some of this conversation in that talk as well later in the year. Thank you very much, Jakob, for being with us today and for sharing this wonderful paper. And for all our participants, thank you for taking out the time to join us and have this very stimulating conversation. We have another paper coming up next month, so please keep an eye out for the announcements and the Zoom links for that. But thank you very much for being here.